Let's start this show with a question. If you can take the Nazi scientist out of Germany, can you take the Nazi out of the scientist? This was a question the heavyweights of the US military, intelligence, the FBI, and the State Department were asking when, under Operation Paperclip, the US government hired about 1,600 Germans post-World War II. Some of these men were full-fledged Nazis. Some were even accused war criminals who engaged in next-level brutality. They'd worked side by side with their beloved leader Adolf Hitler and the murderous ideologues that formed Hitler's inner circle. For decades, the American public was led to believe that all these acquired Nazis were benign scientific luminaries, nothing more. This was a lie, a declassified deception of the highest order. Many of the scientists had blood on their hands, yet they walked on a red carpet into the USA, where, as you'll see later, some had the gall to complain about the uncivilized culture. Yeah, a Nazi scientist actually said that. Today, you'll learn what had to happen to make Operation Paperclip possible. It wasn't easy. Shoehorning Nazis into America, it took a great deal of effort combined with a sprinkle of subterfuge. It also took what some researchers have called stunning hypocrisy on the part of the American government. But you'll be able to learn why the operation was seen as necessary or even imperative. That's highly debatable. We'll let you be the judge when the video ends and you know all the details. You're going to hear about the Nazi scientists whose work led to horrifying experiments on prisoners, yet they were able to have well-paid jobs in the USA. Their backgrounds thoroughly whitewashed. You'll hear about Nazi bankers and industrialists, convicted war criminals who had friends in high places in America. You'll meet the men who worked with the CIA on the programs that preceded MKUltra, Nazi doctors who taught American spies interrogation techniques, incapacitation, and methods of murder that they'd honed in the concentration camps. You'll meet brilliant rocket scientists and aviation experts, once fanatics for Adolf Hitler, whose Nazi pasts were scrubbed before their distinguished careers with the Air Force and NASA. Do we hang him or do we hire him? That was a real conundrum after World War II, where the best of Germany's scientists were concerned. Hang him and we lose a man who could vastly improve American military technology in the face of a total war with the Soviet Union. But hire him and we risk enmeshing ourselves in an international scandal. Also, was the threat of total war exaggerated? All will be revealed. You won't hear this often, but without those Nazi scientists, the USA would have been a less technologically advanced place. Various US corporations would not have grown into the behemoths they became without the expertise of men whose work had sometimes involved wholesale murder. Those Germans changed the landscape of American scientific endeavors and thrust the US, sometimes literally, toward technological supremacy. The Nazis, you could argue, were worth every penny it took to bring them over, but there were risks. A lot of risks. It's still a very controversial topic that few people fully understand. It's a Nazi hot potato stuffed with rancid sauerkraut and dripping toxic mustard. So without further ado, welcome to our latest deep dive, an exploration into the heart of darkness of American human resources. When World War II ended, the Cold War was beginning. The US was preparing for war with the Soviet Union. Both sides soon got busy arresting Nazis and procuring some of them as intelligence assets, looking to hire the best of the scientists. The German war machine had been formidable. The scientists and industrialists who'd helped build that machine were now valuable property. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, a subcommittee of the Joint Intelligence Committee, or JIC, was set up to recruit the most useful Nazi scientists, mostly for weapons projects, including biological and chemical weapons. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were said to prepare for total war with the Soviets, which was expected to include biological warfare, chemical warfare, and atomic warfare. The question was, what had the Nazis developed that the US hadn't? Together, the British and the Americans had already created the Alsace mission to answer the question. The Americans and the Brits worked together, but as you'll see in the video, they didn't always share intelligence. Under Operation Surgeon, the British would also hire Nazis, a scheme of forced relocation that critics would later say involved Gestapo-like methods. This was only made public in 2006. Under the top-secret T-Force unit, the Brits basically kidnapped the Nazis, taking them away from their families. Like the Americans, the British would say this program was all about preventing the Soviets from getting hold of such men. But the truth is, it was also about business. The stolen Nazis, hundreds of them, would make various British firms a lot of money. You'll also see later how Nazi chemical weapons led to the deaths of young British soldiers in grotesque experiments at Britain's Science and Defense Technology campus. The Soviets too, under Operation Oso-Aviakhim, hired over 2,500 Nazi scientists. Still, it seems the US got the best of the Germans, and according to critics, also the worst of them, regarding human rights abuses they committed. This included paperclip scientists, but also some extremely nasty characters secretly hired by American intelligence. As we said, we'll leave it up to you to decide if Operation Paperclip was the right thing to do. It's not an easy call, and we're sure you'll change your mind a few times during the show. The story really starts in 1944, when men belonging to the Alsace mission were trying to solve the puzzle of who was behind the Nazi scientific developments and how far the Nazis had got building an atomic bomb. On November 26, the French 2nd Armored Division had just helped liberate the city of Strasbourg. The city was in flames and the buildings had been reduced to rubble. There was still fighting. Somewhere among that chaos, in an upscale apartment, US soldiers were standing guard around a Dutch-American particle physicist named Samuel Goudsmit. Goudsmit, who was familiar with the work of the brilliant German theoretical physicist Werner Heisenberg, was part of the Alsace mission. At that point in time, the Americans and the British still had a lot to learn about Nazi science. As things would turn out, the Nazis had not gotten very far regarding building a nuclear bomb, but in other scientific ventures, they were way ahead of the Allies. So Goudsmit was surrounded by armed US military personnel in the apartment, which was owned by the German virus expert Dr. Eugen Hagen. The Brits and the Americans were sure Hagen was right at the top where Nazi biological weapon development was concerned. They were ransacking his house, taking advantage of the fact that he had run away when the aerial bombing had gotten too close for comfort. There was a photo of Hitler on the wall, and close to it a cabinet. In that cabinet was a thick stack of files. In the files there was some important information. As Goudsmit and his men spent all night reading, they realized that the Nazis had likely developed biological and chemical weapons far superior to anything the Allies had. Goudsmit learned that the Nazis had been testing their biological weapons on prisoners in the concentration camps. Human testing had helped Nazi scientists get ahead. This was a crime against humanity. It was a bombshell. It was evidence. A memo in the file said 18 died in transport, only 12 are in condition suitable for experiments. The man who said this was August Hirt, a mustard gas specialist who had a Jewish skull collection. He was a war criminal who, like many others, would ensure he'd never face a war crimes conviction by taking control of matters of life and death. Hirt had said he wanted 100 more people to test on, ideally aged 20 to 40 and in healthy physical condition. He signed off with the usual Heil Hitler. The memo was dated November 15, 1943. It was just one of many memos featuring many names and many places that told the Allies what the Nazis had been doing to prisoners in those camps. Writer Annie Jacobson, whose seminal book on Operation Paperclip has helped us bring you this show, wrote that in this cache of memos, the Alsace team discovered the most diabolical secrets of the Third Reich. This was a game changer. The Nazis had been testing chemicals, drugs, vaccines, deadly pathogens, and conducting all kinds of heinous experiments on humans. Goudsmit wrote a long list of people involved in the research, including Dr. Kurt Blome and Dr. Walter Schreiber. These are two of the most controversial foreigners in U.S. history, men who one day would work with the CIA Director Allen Dulles and the MKUltra mind control experiments boss, Stanley Gottlieb. What they did with American intelligence has been called the U.S.'s nastiest secret post-World War II. We'll discuss Blome and Schreiber in more detail later. For now, we'll just say they were paperclip possibilities, but giving these guys visas was never going to be straightforward. About 2 weeks after the apartment discovery, there was another major find in Germany near the Coesfeld Forest, where the magnificent Varlar Castle was located. The Allies found a launch pad on the castle grounds. Sitting on it was a rocket, the now famous V-2 rocket with a 2,000-pound warhead attached. This thing could fly about 5 times the speed of sound. It was a monster, the bee's knees of missiles, which had already leveled parts of London in the form of its earlier iteration, the V-1. The British military, which was terrified of them, believed the Nazis would use them with biological or chemical weapon payloads. Had the Nazis done that, Britain would have been in serious trouble. These rockets were unstoppable. The Allies had nothing close to as good. One of the geniuses behind them was Dr. Wernher von Braun, who would one day become NASA's most influential scientist. He'd be called the father of space travel, an American hero. He was also a former Nazi and a member of the SS, a major in the SS. Without him, the US would have possibly been beaten by the Soviets in the space race. One of von Braun's former American colleagues was once asked if the US would have gotten to the moon when it did without him. He answered, having been in Huntsville working for the von Braun team in 1957 to 1967, I don't think it would have been possible. No one came up to his level of mastery on the subject. As you can imagine, the fact that one of the US's greatest scientists of all time was a former SS man was problematic. The question is, what did von Braun do during the war? What did he know about the slavery and murder that happened to further Nazi science? We'll talk more about that soon. Walter Dornberger, the chief of the V2 program, was another man with a sketchy past whom the US would one day put on payroll. As you'll see, his actions as a war criminal were very severe, which included him murdering forced laborers in the Netherlands after project completion. The famed war historian Anthony Beaver wrote that Dornberger forced Dutch women to become prostitutes for Nazi technicians, and he had them murdered in groups of 20 after they'd surfaced the men. How could such a man ever collect a paycheck in the USA? The short answer is that he made a lot of money for Bell Aircraft and Boeing, and was a major part of the development of the North American X-15 aircraft. On October 3, 1942, Dornberger gave a speech at the Peenemünde Army Research Center, one of the bases where next-level rocket development was happening. Dornberger, a firm believer in Aryan superiority, proudly exclaimed, "This third day of October 1942 is the first of a new era in transportation, that of space travel." In 1944, Hitler would say there were only two men in his life to whom he ever apologized. One was Dornberger, whose rocket research Hitler admitted he once hadn't fully gotten behind. If there were such a game as Nazi scientists' top trumps, von Braun and Dornberger would very well almost be unbeatable cards. They were smart and successful, but they both understood very well that their rockets couldn't be built without slave labor. But were they true Nazis, what we might call a Nazi's Nazi? They'd once clinked flutes of champagne together, both wearing Nazi Knights crosses around their necks awarded to them by Hitler. This was the highest award during World War II. Hitler loved both these men. The celebration was over one of their V2s having just hit a Rex cinema in Antwerp, killing 567 people who'd been watching a Gary Cooper movie. Besides Belgian civilians, 296 Allied soldiers from Britain, the United States, Poland, and Canada were also killed. In Nazi circles, Dornberger and von Braun were the toast of the town. God forbid, thought the Americans after World War II, that the Soviets got hold of them. General Gervase William Treichel, who was then leading the US's new rocket branch, knew the Germans were leagues ahead of everyone else in terms of rocket development. So, to save what would have been millions of dollars to get ahead of the Russians, his team sequestered German rockets, rocket technology, rocket parts, and later rocket makers. One of the reasons the Nazis were ahead was because they'd reintroduced slavery. Many thousands of prisoners already starving had worked building Nazi rockets in an underground tunnel complex known as Mittelwerk, or Middle Works. The slaves at Mittelwerk were from all over Europe. They were captured soldiers, Jewish people, convicted criminals, and Slavs from Russia and elsewhere. The first 107 were taken from the Buchenwald concentration camp, about 50 miles away. A sign reading, "Jedan das seine," everyone gets what he deserves, was posted over the camp gates. Out of the 280,000 prisoners there, about 56,000 didn't make it out. They were worked to death, beaten to death, starved to death, or exterminated. At the mine, the Germans were afraid that if they'd given these men tools, they could fight back, so they made the prisoners dig with their hands. One of the men who oversaw much of the work was Arthur Rudolph, a brilliant rocket engineer who would one day help put American astronauts on the moon and be awarded NASA's Exceptional Service Medal and the NASA Distinguished Service Medal. When he collected these awards, no one spoke about the fact that he'd once been a full-on Nazi ideologue. He believed in Hitler's cause, joining the Nazi Party early on in 1931. Hitler himself greatly admired him. Rudolph's expertise was building the rockets and putting the pieces together, which meant keeping an eye on the assembly lines where prisoners did 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. After a couple of months, about 8,000 prisoners worked under him at the mine. They worked with little ventilation, in cramped, dark conditions, with scarcely any water or food. The prisoners slept in the tunnels on wooden benches. They suffered from all manner of diseases, including sometimes deadly lung conditions, pleurisy, and pneumonia. They died from beatings, dysentery, and starvation. When they collapsed and died on the job, they were picked up and thrown into a pile or taken somewhere to be burned. The journalist we mentioned earlier, Annie Jacobson, said these walking skeletons would sometimes be crushed to death under rocket parts. They died from burns to their lungs. If they worked too slowly, they might be beaten to death or to the point of death. 30,000 of the 60,000 of the total slaves in the mine were worked to death. It's conceivable then that men like Rudolf von Braun and Dornberger, heroes of American science, would one day face scrutiny. What evidence was there that they'd been part of mass murder? Were they innocent as they'd one day claim? On May 6, 1944, the Nazi Party's George Ricci, another very smart engineer, held a meeting. Ricci was the general manager at Mittelwerk. The attendees, including von Braun, Dornberger, and Rudolf, discussed procuring more slave labor for the mines. So many men had already been worked to death, and they needed to fill those men's shoes. The Nazi scientists all agreed that 1,800 new prisoners, all French and semi-skilled, should be used. In a memo, von Braun said he would go to Buchenwald himself to seek out more qualified detainees. We'll talk more about this later, but first let's go to Auschwitz at the end of the war, when the Nazis there were busy trying to destroy all the paperwork that connected them to their science-based savagery. One of those paper destroyers was Otto Ambros, an outstanding chemist who had worked on chemical weapons such as mustard gas and also the deadly nerve agents sarin and Tauben gas. He was said to have been Hitler's favorite chemist, developing newfangled chemical weapons. He was also the manager at IG Farben's synthetic and rubber factory at the Auschwitz subcamp Buna, which was where the great Holocaust writer Primo Levi was a slave. We know a lot about the hell of Buna thanks to Levi's famous work, This Is the Man, in which he said one of the things that shook him to his core was how the Germans could beat the prisoners seemingly without feeling anger. The labor camps were all about brutal efficiency, not so much hatred, according to Levi. In the book, Levi explained how men vanished when they got too weak to work. He and others knew where they'd gone, over to the death camp at the nearby Birkenau, where the crematorium chimneys emitted smoke day and night. Levi said that the prisoners would always deny that they'd be picked out for extermination, explaining, "The young tell the young that the old will be chosen. The healthy tell the healthy that the ill will be chosen. Specialists will be excluded. German Jews will be excluded. Low numbers will be excluded. You will be chosen. I will be excluded." His restrained descriptions of prisoners fighting for survival in the camp, even if it meant turning on each other, are heartbreaking. Behind it all was the mastermind of the factory of the whole operation, Mr. Ambros. Ambros's chemicals needed to be tested, and as you know now, the Nazis turned humans into guinea pigs. That was one of the reasons Ambros was getting rid of documents when the war came to a close. Considering the scene, you'd naturally think such a man would never become indispensable to American corporations. You'd be wrong. The story of Ambros and his American adventure is a story seldom told. As Ambros was destroying the documents, SS guards were busy trying to blow up Crematoria 5 and take apart Crematoria 2 and 3. The Red Army was on its way. The place that was hell on earth was more chaotic than ever. Guards with dogs barking all around them were rounding up emaciated prisoners, preparing them for what would be a march to the death for many. Levi was there. He later said he was shocked when a female German chemist asked him if he could please fix her bicycle tire. That was the first please he'd heard in a long time. He was lucky. When the death march eventually began, he was in a hospital bed with scarlet fever. Also staying behind was Ambros, but not because he was ill. He'd once drawn up the blueprints for the plant. He'd chosen the location. Buna was his baby. He'd invented synthetic rubber for German planes, tanks, and trucks. He might have felt he had to stay behind in the place that he'd effectively created. But on January 23, 1945, with Levi still laid up in bed, Ambros fled with the last remaining Germans. A few days later, snow was everywhere. Levi said he saw the men approaching all dressed in white camouflage. He was relieved to see red stars on their clothing. The Soviets had arrived. Levi's journey wasn't quite over. His odyssey as a displaced person was about to begin. Otto Ambros was also in for quite the journey, but unlike Levi, he'd be treated to American-style comforts. The chemical weapons that had been left behind were now the responsibility of the Alsace men, commanded by Colonel Boris Pasch, a man who would go on to have a career with the CIA, managing so-called wet affairs, aka torture and murder programs. The T-Forces worked under the British-American Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS. They had big red T's painted on their helmets. While Alsace was important regarding understanding Nazi science, The orders of the T forces were to take scientifically valuable targets. They cleaned up just as the Monuments Men took valuable works of art and other culturally significant monuments. Working for CIOS was the U.S.'s Lieutenant Colonel Philip R. Tarr, whose British counterpart was Major Edmund Tilley. They were both experts in chemical warfare. Before Operation Paperclip officially began, they were supposed to be working together to understand the Nazis' chemical warfare objectives. They both knew the Nazis had the capability to make devastating chemical weapons, but the Nazis hadn't unleashed them, and the Allies weren't sure what they were. One of those weapons was the nerve agent Taban, which the Germans had concealed under codenames Trilon 83 and Substance 83. It was so secretive they even used codenames for the raw materials. Tarr and Tilley had intelligence about Trilon 83, so when the IG Farben factories fell into the hands of the Allies, the Nazi scientists were interrogated about this secret chemical weapon. Both the Americans and the British still didn't know exactly what it was, only that it existed, and it had, according to one intelligence report, astounding properties as some kind of nerve agent. The German scientists, said another report, lied vigorously when asked about it. Meanwhile, the Allies had discovered who the best scientists in the Third Reich were from a cache of papers rescued by a Polish scientist at Bonn University. These papers contained a who's who of the Nazi science world. This became known as the Alsenberg list, after the mechanical engineer Werner Alsenberg. Alsenberg was the head of the Reich Research Council Planning Office, bringing around 5,000 scientists and technicians from the front lines to work on science-based warfare. A member of the SS and a high-ranking member of the Gestapo, Alsenberg was a very dedicated Nazi. His list, now in the hands of the Allies, was a godsend. Now it was a matter of finding those men. You won't be surprised to hear that Alsenberg himself ended up working for the Americans. He supplied the Americans with about 15,000 names, which kicked off the U.S.'s recruitment program, not yet named Operation Paperclip. As you'll find out, the reason it got that name itself is interesting, if not a bit grim. The first name for the program was Operation Overcast. The hunt for Nazis was on. Hitler was dead, having taken care of himself in his bunker in Berlin. The Allies would say German bunkers could sure take a lot of bombing without falling in on themselves. So what did the Americans do? They hired the Nazi bunker guy. More about that soon. Heinrich Himmler, who tried to disguise himself at an interrogation camp, Camp 31, was described by the British military who captured him as a small, ugly man wearing an eye patch. The British didn't fully understand at that point that Himmler was the man who'd given the green light to much of human experimentation in the camps. Seemingly knowing he was done, Himmler pulled a pair of glasses from his pocket and said formally and proudly, "Heinrich Himmler," during a physical examination. He managed to put a small object into his mouth, and the next minute he was on the floor dead, froth forming around his mouth. One of the British assistant doctors wrote in his diary, "The evil thing breathed its last breath." He didn't know half of what Himmler had done, which we'll recount throughout this show. The Allies were losing Nazi leaders by the day, which wasn't great for intelligence efforts. They needed those Nazis. They harbored many secrets of the war, of science, and of the Soviet Union. There were still many missing documents, there were hidden weapons, there were toxins, and there was gold, lots and lots of gold. And of course, there were monsters, whom the public expected would face trial and swing by a rope for what they'd done. 6 million Jews had died at the hands of the Nazis, often in the most horrendous ways. 3.3 to 3.5 million Soviet prisoners of war had been captured by Nazi Germany, and between 2.5 to 3 million died in Nazi custody, often being worked to death as slave laborers. Undoubtedly, many Nazis would hang for the war crimes. The good news for the Allies was some big Nazi names were already in custody. This included the Minister of Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer, who despite his high position would always deny that he knew what was going on in the camps. One of the highest-ranking Nazi scientists of the war, Kurt Bloema, was also in custody. We said earlier how this biological weapons expert, one of the monsters of the concentration camps, would end up helping the Americans with their torture and mind control work. This was under the precursor projects to MKUltra, Project Bluebird, Artichoke, and MK Naomi. Bloema was under house arrest, but he didn't reveal his identity. The same went for Otto Ambros, who you'll remember was the man behind the Buna plant at Auschwitz. The Allies also had Siegfried Niemeyer, the head of technical development at the Reich Ministry of Aviation. They'd all been arrested, but the Alsace people hadn't learned just how important they were. We don't need to tell you that these men feared for their freedom and their lives, having been such a major part of the German war effort, especially the likes of Blome and Ambros, whose work had involved committing monstrous human rights abuses. On the other hand, rocket specialists Rudolf, Dornberger, and von Braun had already sold themselves to the Americans. They'd signed on the dotted line. They were willing to work contractually making rockets for the Americans. Still, getting them into the US would be hard, and ensuring no one knew about the war crimes accusations would be harder. For many in the American military, this was a tricky situation. British documents also showed that there was pushback regarding hiring men who'd been full-on Nazi ideologues. Not only would it be unfair to all the people who'd suffered at their hands, but it was a security risk. An American officer for the Third Army wrote, "The question of who is a Nazi is often a dark riddle. The question of what is a Nazi is also not easy to answer." The Allies just didn't know exactly what kind of men they were thinking about hiring. Still, hiring those rocket specialists was never in doubt. They were geniuses, and they were going to build things in America that would make the American scientists, and more importantly Russian scientists, envious. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF, had around 1,500 German scientists that they'd separated at the camps from the other German prisoners. Back in Washington, it was agreed that the Nazi war machine, which had proved to be almost unstoppable, could not start again. It was also agreed that the scientists might be able to help with the US's ongoing fight against the Japanese in the Pacific. For this reason, hiring had to be expedited. The Americans now had many parts of V-2 rockets in their hands, but it wasn't Lego, and the Americans didn't have blueprints. What happened next was a lot of Nazi scientists telling the Americans that if they wanted to build the rockets, they need so-and-so and so-and-so to get the job done. The Nazis never wasted a second in warning the Americans how talented someone was, and that if that person fell into the hands of the Soviets, the Americans would be in trouble. Karl Otto Fleischer, who had worked under von Braun, said the Americans would need Dr. Eberhard Rees, another rocket specialist who would one day become one of NASA's main scientists. Rees said that he'd need Walter Riedel, who, unknown to Fleischer, had literally just had his teeth kicked out by the Rough Boys at the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, or CIC, in a safe house in Germany. The CIC, which did a lot of sketchy things after the war, including getting Nazi intelligence assets out of Germany through rat lines, was known to make German captives run through the gauntlet. The Germans got several beatings, which they sometimes reportedly didn't survive. Riedel's intelligence report had him as a Nazi. He told the Americans the truth. That was that he wanted to go to the moon. He was the chief designer of the V-2, he said. He told the Americans there were about 40 other guys like him, and that the Americans would need them. Otherwise, the Russians would get them. To some, it seemed like these clever German scientists were using the Americans to get their friends out of trouble. It worked, especially when Riedel warned that his colleagues had invented space weapons that the Soviets might use for good and possibly evil. Space weapons! This was way ahead of American technology if it was true. As for what happened to Riedel, the New York Times wrote the headline in 1949, "Nazi V-2 designer aids our Air Force. Dr. Walter Riedel tells how rocket was developed and says Russians have it." The article didn't mention that U.S. intelligence had Riedel down as an ardent Nazi. U.S. Army Major Robert B. Staver, chief of the Jet Propulsion Section of the Research and Intelligence Branch of the United States Army Ordnance Corps, was one of the men responsible for sorting out the mess of what these captured Nazis had actually done in the war. Dr. H.P. Robertson, a brilliant American physicist at the Office of Scientific Research and Development, was another. They both interrogated the German rocket men for many hours, and they both agreed, "We need them." But they disagreed on one thing. Staver was okay with giving the Nazis privileges, treating them like American workers, but Robertson disliked them. He thought that they were opportunists who'd done terrible things and should be treated as hostiles. Robertson, a friend of Albert Einstein, hated the Nazis with a vengeance. The U.S. might have needed them, but this did not sit well with him. For Staver, it was a matter of war strategy. For men like this, morality didn't really come into it. You had to do what you had to do to get ahead. The difference of opinion would exist throughout the entire Operation Paperclip program. Some Americans were especially outraged when they heard that the rocket scientists were all sent to a ski resort in the Alps that had once hosted Hitler. There, they ate well and sunbathed on deck chairs during the day while drinking alcohol at night. One of the scientists, Dieter Hutzel, wrote in his memoir, "Rain was infrequent and almost every day sunbathing was possible on the lawn-covered yard." Matters were frustrating because the Germans always held things back while asking for more. They played their poker hand well. They made sure the Americans needed them and needed every last one of them. They also knew that one loose word might connect them to war crimes, so they said as little as possible. They were geniuses after all, aware that loose lips sink ships. Even so, after one interrogation, the American interrogator wrote that Arthur Rudolph, the Middlework mine boss and future NASA star, was definitely 100% Nazi and a dangerous type. The Americans then got hold of the Nazi-guided weapons expert, Herbert A. Wagner. They wanted to fast-track this one to the USA. His technology had blown up a good number of British ships and killed a lot of men. But the Americans could certainly make good use of guided bombs in the Pacific. But back in the US, when J. Edgar Hoover performed a background check on Wagner, he discovered that not only was Wagner a dedicated Nazi, but he'd been in the SS. He was also said to be a raging alcoholic. Rules are rules. Giving such men a visa would be difficult. Still, intelligence said his affiliation with the Nazi Party was more about work opportunities than ideology. So, off he went to the US, where he did end up eventually helping kill Japanese people in the Pacific. Weapons experts were much less problematic than medical experts, the people who'd done some seriously inhumane things at concentration camps. They'd put men in freezing baths just to see how they could warm them up, often resulting in death. They'd shoved prisoners in high-altitude chambers until they passed out and died. They tested all kinds of drugs on people. They cut people open, they rubbed dirt in their wounds, they cut out organs without anesthetic, all in the name of science. Such people should have been hanged. But what if they knew something that the Americans very much wanted to know too? Keeping pilots alive at high altitudes or keeping them conscious was always an issue. An American who worked on such aviation technology was Lieutenant Colonel Harry Armstrong. Armstrong was aware of the Luftwaffe's medical research, so he was tasked with finding the Luftwaffe's best doctors and possibly bringing them back to the States. At the top of his list was the Nazis' most prized aviation scientist, Dr. Hubertus Struckold. Struckold understood the limits of the human body in flight better than anyone in the world. He'd one day be celebrated in the USA as the father of space medicine, but his past would eventually come back to haunt him. To understand what he knew, he had to work outside the parameters of ethics, far outside. Armstrong and Struckold had met before the war and had great respect for each other, but after the war began, their research would take on very different forms. The Americans were not in the habit of letting people die in the name of science. Well, not usually. When Armstrong found Struckold at a detention camp, he was already aware of the rumors about human experimentation. They were more than rumors. Struckold was on the CROCAS list, which stood for the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects. He was down as having committed capital war crimes. To set someone like Struckold up in the US with a nice house and a great salary was asking a lot. Even so, no one knew what he knew. The future father of space medicine was a big deal. When the Dachau camp was liberated, it was seen, or partly seen, what had taken place at the experimental cell block 5. As the Red Cross was treating prisoners, Dr. Leo Alexander for the Americans investigated what the Nazi doctors had been doing there. Alexander would, in the near future, help write the Nuremberg Code. He was an American hero who stood by the principles of medical ethics and was very uncomfortable with paperclip. Alexander, through the help of interviews and document collection, put together a tale of absolute horror. When he found out about the low-pressure chambers and the gruesome deaths in them, he almost sobbed. He didn't think this was possible in the 20th century, writing home to his wife Phyllis, "German science presents a grim spectacle." He called this a maelstrom of depravity in the concentration camps where violent death, torture, and suffering had taken place. He wasn't even sure if this was workable science, calling what the Nazi doctors had done really depraved pseudoscientific criminality. Actually, some of the Nazi experiments were pseudoscientific, but many weren't, which is the reason the scientists were in such high demand. The men who had committed such acts were not the kind of people you wanted living on your street under a false name. Dr. Alexander wrote that the Nazis had sterilized and euthanized disabled people, including thousands of children. A man involved in the program was Karl Kleist, who ended up on the Paperclip Valuable Nazis list. It's not known if he ever made it to America. Alexander saw a new depravity almost every day of his investigations. One time he wrote, "It sometimes seems as if the Nazis had taken special pains in making practically every nightmare come true." He got to interview Struckold, and as often happened, Struckold passed the buck, saying the human experimentation at Dachau was mostly the work of Dr. Sigmund Rascher, who you'll be pleased to know never made it to the US. Under Himmler, Rascher had frozen people and subjected them to high-altitude experiments. In his blood coagulation experiments, he'd given prisoners a blood-clotting drug and then had them shot in the neck, just to see if the drug worked. He gave others the same drug, Polygal, and then had their limbs amputated without anesthesia. We should just add that many doctors were involved in such experiments. It was rarely the work of one man. Rascher's corruption and tendency to hurt his own staff led to the Nazis executing him before the Allies could get him. According to Alexander's research, Rascher had taken his orders from Dr. Siegfried Ruff, the director of the Aviation Medicine Department at the German Experimental Institute for Aviation. At the doctor's trial, which we'll discuss later, Ruff would be accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity for conducting medical atrocities, but he was acquitted. He then went to work for the Americans. Before that, the U.S. Army Air Forces had him conduct high-altitude experiments for them at the Heidelberg Hospital in Germany. This wasn't yet part of Paperclip. As for Struckold, the U.S. Army made a deal with him. He would serve as co-chairman with his old acquaintance Harry Armstrong for a top-secret Air Force project. This was the same project Mr. Ruff was hired for at the Heidelberg Hospital. It was top secret because it was supposed to be against the law for foreign powers to conduct military research in Germany. The U.S. kept it a secret from all the Allies. Struckold told the Americans he needed 58 other Nazis for the project. Many of them would later quietly walk into the US of A with their visa stamps in order, hoping that their pasts had been buried behind them. There were people in the highest echelons of government and intelligence who saw this as a possible security nightmare. It was also hypocritical. The State Department was doing everything to get countries such as Argentina and Uruguay to send the Nazis who were hiding out there back to Europe to face war crimes tribunals. Yet, accused war criminals were now working for the US. It wasn't just the State Department that voiced opposition to the Nazi hiring program. Various colonels and generals in the War Department were opposed to it. One of them, whose name is redacted in declassified files, said it was a very bad idea to, quote, open our arms and bring in German technicians and treat them as honored guests. The Department of Justice also chimed in, stating that it was almost impossible to do proper background checks on all of these men in so little time. The Department of Labor and the Department of Commerce also had their qualms about rolling out a red carpet to men whose war activity, the full extent of which was not fully comprehended. Then, you had guys such as John J. McCloy, who'd been Assistant Secretary of War during World War II under Henry Stimson, and would go on to do many things, including becoming President of the World Bank, U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, a Warren Commission investigator, and advisor to future presidents. He would later be called one of the U.S.'s 6 wise men, the bankers, lawyers, and diplomats who allegedly ran the U.S. behind whoever was president. McCloy had clout. For him and others around him, ethics didn't come into the Nazi hiring issue. He was one of the realists who said those Nazi scientists had to be exploited to bolster American power and the American economy. As Annie Jacobson wrote about him, the end justified the means. For McCloy, people like Göring and Hess had to be punished, but the scientists and industrialists had to be saved and utilized. You see later how McCloy would take his belief perhaps a step too far, upsetting a lot of people around the world, especially Jewish people, who'd suffered the most at the hands of the Nazis. A man whose job it was to examine just how bad the hired Nazis were was John Doliboy, an Army intelligence officer at the Collecting and Dissemination Division of G2. He was an expert on the Nazi party hierarchy, and so after the war he was one of the chief interrogators of the imprisoned Germans. This made him important in the area of Operation Paperclip. He became well known as a man that really got to know a lot of the Nazis and so was able to explain what had made them do what they had done. He conducted some of those interviews at a hotel in Luxembourg, which the Americans called the Ash Can. Doliboy conducted psychological tests, including Rorschach ink blot tests on the likes of top-ranked Nazis, such as Hermann Göring, Karl Donitz, and Albert Speer. Doliboy had seen the aftermath of Nazi horrors at liberated concentration camps. He'd studied the Nazis as much as anyone. What drives a man toward committing such evil, he'd asked himself. The first time that Doliboy met Hermann Göring, chief of the Luftwaffe, Göring was in a foul mood. He'd been tricked into thinking he was going on vacation. Instead, he arrived at Ashcan with a valet, 11 suitcases, and 22,000 Parakodin pills, weak opioids that Göring was addicted to. Göring had not been expecting to visit a prison, but Doliboy let him know that he'd be treated fairly under the Articles of War. Another top Nazi who Doliboy tried to figure out was Hans Frank, the so-called Butcher of Krakow, who arrived at Ashcan in pajamas that were covered in his own blood. He had a reputation for committing obscene evil. He'd overseen the extermination, forced labor, and torture of many, many Jews. He harmed himself just before he was arrested. He survived, as did the diaries he'd written about much of the depravity he'd been responsible for. Doliboy later explained that some of the men at the Ashcan had been with Hitler at the beginning of his rise to power. He called these men Nazi gangsters. Still, as arrestees, he said they looked more like frightened children. Göring, said Doliboy, got scared when there were thunderstorms. The war criminal and Hitler's so-called yes man, Wilhelm Keitel, was obsessed with his own reflection and loved sunbathing, said Doliboy. High-ranking Nazi Robert Ley was told off at the Ashcan for his habit of constantly masturbating in the bathtub. If these were monsters, they were also human, all too human. Doliboy said that they were all eager to talk and always played their favorite game of casting blame on someone other than them. In terms of who would be hanged or given a job in the USA, the hard part was trying to figure out who was lying and who was telling the truth. Doliboy said sometimes they just wanted a shoulder to cry on. Many of them, he said, couldn't believe that they would be tried for their crimes. Some of them wouldn't. The U.S. Chemical Warfare Service, now aware of the Nazi programs to make nerve agents, wanted the Nazi expertise. When the British Army's tanks discovered a hiding place in the forest near Munster, they came upon 260 kilograms of Tauben-filled bombs. Tauben, you'll remember, is a nerve agent that can kill a man in small doses very quickly. The U.S. Army shipped the Tauben back to the United States, 530 tons of the stuff, to be tested immediately. As you'll later see, how it was tested would one day become a scandal. But the Tauben wasn't much good without the scientists who made it. Still, Howard K. Travers of the State Department wrote that his department should do everything to prevent German chemists and others from entering this country. His wish wouldn't come true. The Americans had already captured most of the leading Nazi chemists and biological weapons makers, and some of them would pass the test to get into the U.S. The Americans and the British were keeping them at Kronsberg Castle, a medieval German castle not too far from the city of Frankfurt that had been a Nazi base and a favorite retreat of Göring. It would have been the Luftwaffe headquarters during Operation Sea Lion, the land invasion of Great Britain that never happened. Now it was an interrogation center for the Brits and the Americans, which they nicknamed the Dust Bin. The imprisoned Nazis lived quite well there, able to roam around the grounds, play chess, and sunbathe. Hitler's personal doctor Karl Brandt ran a gymnastics class in the mornings. During the war, Brandt had been partly in charge of the T4 mass murder involuntary euthanasia program. Now, he was the Nazi Jane Fonda. He was showing high-ranking Nazis how to stretch before doing star jumps, a surreal sight indeed for the Americans. Dustbin was now home to the top Nazi chemists, 20 of them who had worked for IG Farben, 6 of those on the board. The man who'd made the Tauben, which the British had found at a place that they named Robber's Lair, was Dr. Gerhard Schrader. One of the men sarin gas was named after. His name, Schrader, was the S part of the word sarin. Otto Ambrose, whom you've already met, was the A part. Major Edmund Tilley, who we told you was a chemical expert for British intelligence, was responsible for interrogating this hive of German chemical brainpower. Tilley wasn't expecting Schrader to be open about his wartime work. He was far from reticent. He talked about Tauben and how he and other chemists discovered it in 1936. It was supposed to be a pesticide, he said, a very powerful one. It once blinded him for 2 weeks when he was experimenting in his lab. After seeing how well Tauben wiped out lice, He and his staff killed a healthy ape with it in a matter of minutes after spraying it in a chamber. It was then called Preparation 991, which Schrader said he made to beat the lice on the battlefront. Schrader told Tilly he'd become upset when he realized his highly potent toxin would not be used for killing lice. He helped invent something terrible, so terrible it was named after the word taboo. Killing humans with chemical weapons was certainly taboo, but the Nazis studied it and the Americans wanted to catch up. Tilly learned from the IG Farben chemist Karl Crouch that he and others had invented sarin, which was even more potent than Tavin. Tilly was then taken aback after Crouch said that when he'd been held at a hospital, he'd been visited by 2 American officers. One of them was Lieutenant Colonel Philip R. Tarr, whom we mentioned earlier. He was supposed to be Tilly's American partner at the PSYOS, but Tarr had told Tilly nothing about this visit and nothing about sarin. The Americans were holding information back from the Brits, Tilly then knew, and it wouldn't be the first time. Crouch later said, as far as I could tell, they, the USA, were intending to erect similar plants in the USA. This was the first time the Brits figured out that the Americans were running their own separate program and were planning to recreate Nazi science in the US. This was not what had been agreed upon. The Americans had gone rogue. Still, British intelligence was well known for being incredibly wily and much more experienced than US intelligence. There was trust, but it only went so far. Tilly discovered more about Otto Ambros, who was now linked with mass murder and slavery. He tested those potent chemicals on humans in the camps. Little did Tilly know that the Americans had already arrested Ambros and they were about to put him on the payroll, working for them at Heidelberg Hospital. The British, meanwhile, wanted to try him for war crimes. This was why PSYOS was sometimes jokingly called chaos. There were too many hidden motives at work. The British knew that Ambros was the first to strike a deal with the SS for IG Farben. The SS would provide slave labor, and IG Farben would pay 3 Reichsmarks for every prisoner. In a letter, Ambros wrote, "Our new friendship with the SS is proving very profitable." Basically, he'd arranged the slave program for his factory. This made him a major war criminal. 3 Reichsmarks, and you could work a person to death. Himmler had told Ambros that he'd get 1,000 laborers immediately, but he could expect 30,000 more in no time at all. In short, Ambros was the key to making Buna a success, if you can call it that. As you'll see later, he ended up advising the American company Dow Chemical one day. He'd be a major player in the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. He'd also be involved in the development of a nightmare drug, thalidomide. This was after some prison time. We'll explain soon. Tilly also learned that Zyklon B, the gas used to murder millions of Jews, was an IG Farben product. When Tilly asked IG Farben board member Baron von Schnitzler if Otto Ambros and others were aware that this chemical was being used to wipe out much of the Jewish population in Europe, he said yes, Ambros knew, and many other Nazi scientists knew. In the meantime, an argument broke out between the British and the Americans. The Brits wanted Ambros to face the music, and the Americans wanted his expertise. Ambros did a runner and escaped to the French zone, where he started doing work for the French. Major P.M. Wilson for the British was infuriated, writing in a report that he was appalled by the friendly treatment of a known war criminal by the Americans. Wilson would later write in a classified report that the Americans had protected Ambros for industrial chemical purposes back in the U.S. It wouldn't be until 1985 that the Americans came clean about this when declassified documents were released. The Americans would come under criticism again when it came to biological weapons experts who were war criminals. The German who led the Nazi biological warfare program was someone we mentioned earlier, Kurt Blome. He was a very high-ranking Nazi scientist and a deputy surgeon general of the Third Reich, a very big deal, who knew more than anyone about weapons made with plague, cholera, and other pathogens. After being named in the Hagen files, he also ended up at the dustbin. It was known how important he was, but when interrogated at dustbin, he was initially evasive with his answers. Blome seemed to have a change of mind one day, deciding to tell half of the truth. He told his interrogators that it was Himmler who was behind the biological weapons programs. He said Himmler even kept it a secret from Hitler, who Blome said wasn't very interested in biological warfare. Himmler, he said, had one particular fascination: bubonic plague. Blome said he warned Himmler that using the plague bombs could backfire on Germany, so Himmler said Blome told him to get to work on a vaccine. You'll meet the vaccine maker soon, another war criminal who'd one day shame the Americans. Blome was given an entire block at the Dachau camp, he said. He also told his interrogators that he'd refused to test plague on humans, but Himmler had threatened him with treason. He was passing the buck. He was lying. He said he and Himmler agreed that testing plague in the camps could wipe out an entire camp, which wasn't good for anyone. Blome said that they then formed a plan to drop plague-infected rats off near enemy shores so they would swim to land and infect the public or an army. Blome told the interrogators that the rats were dumb and instead of swimming to shore, they swam around in circles and drowned. Only a few made it to land, he said. Blome reiterated that Himmler had ordered him to experiment on humans. He said Dr. Karl Gross, a biological weapons researcher with the Hygiene Institute of the Waffen-SS, also wanted to conduct human experimentation. Blome explained that he was in charge of creating such biological weapons, and Dr. Walter Schreiber was in charge of protecting Germans from such weapons. In both cases, humans were needed for the testing. Blome was the sword, the pathogen, and Schreiber was the shield or vaccine. They'd both end up working for the Americans, but not without difficulties. Blome also warned his dustbin interrogators. His laboratory, where all his pathogens were contained, had fallen to the Soviets, he said. Worse, Walter Schreiber had been captured by the Soviets. The Americans had the sword and the Soviets had the shield. Blome made sure that Americans were worried, further enhancing his importance. For the Americans, and to a lesser extent the Brits, it was a matter of who to hang and who to hire. The British were arguably more in the hanging camp, but the Americans, who would be fighting in the Cold War, were thinking about the future. Another problem was the imprisoned Nazis had gotten much wiser. They were now conspiring with each other to save themselves. They were laughing and joking and telling lots of lies. Later, you'll meet another man who analyzed them psychologically. At Ashcan, an annoyed Colonel Burton Andrus decided to show the Nazi prisoners a video of what the U.S. troops had seen when they liberated Buchenwald: emaciated men and piles of dead bodies. Andrus later wrote that this was to jog the prisoners' memories before he dimmed the lights and told the prisoners, "You know about these things, and I have no doubt many of you actively participated in them." As the film showed images of the absolute horrors of the camp, Hans Frank, a man you'll remember had overseen mass torture and execution in occupied Poland, was gagged into a handkerchief. Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, even though he'd helped deport masses of Jews to the camps, stood up and walked out, apparently upset. The Luftwaffe's Albert Kesselring, who'd led the Battle of Britain and would be accused of ordering massacres, was said to have turned white. Göring sighed and exaggerated how bored he felt. Walter Funk, Reich Minister for Economic Affairs and President of Reichsbank, approached Colonel Andrus when the film was over. When they were to one side, he admitted with tears in his eyes, "I have been a bad man. I want to tell you about it." He looked Andrus in the face and said, "It was me who made the order to take all the gold out of every prisoner's mouth." Andrus said Funk told him that he'd ordered that the gold would be knocked out while the prisoners were alive, but if they were dead, it was far less bother. Funk later denied ever saying that to Andrus at the Nuremberg trials. On August 10, 1945, the military intelligence officer and Nazi expert John Doleboy received a letter of authority telling him many of the German prisoners were going to be transferred. He wasn't told the reason. Doleboy later said that he'd learned many of these men were hired to work on projects similar to the ones they'd worked on during the war. They were taken away in trucks. According to Doleboy, that's when the prisoners saw for the first time just how much destruction there'd been in Germany. They looked shocked, he said, having hidden out for much of the war. On the way, their convoy stopped beside a row of army trucks. Doleboy said the stink was awful. Men retched at the side of the road. Doleboy asked a soldier what was under the tarps. The soldier pulled it back. It was piles of dead bodies in every truck. Doleboy said it was the most horrible sight he'd ever seen. When he was interviewed, age 93, he said, "I still smell that foul odor of death." For people like Doleboy, hiring the Nazis who'd caused so much pain and suffering and death was not easy to accept. On August 12th, a C-47 transport plane landed to bring a new prisoner to Doleboy. There was a lot of security for whoever was on this plane. It was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a tall, mean-looking man with a face full of dueling scars. He'd been secret police, a man so feared even Himmler didn't like going near him. Kaltenbrunner was the cliched evil Nazi of the late 20th century horror movies, but he was the real deal. He'd been behind so much suffering. When he spoke with Doleboy, he admitted to hating Jews, but he said he was not involved in what happened at the concentration camps and had even had words with Hitler about what happened in the camps. "I'm his soldier, and I only obeyed orders," he told Doleboy, a familiar refrain among captured Nazis. Doleboy later said, Kaltenbrunner was a ruthless killer determined to save his own skin. At this point, the name Operation Paperclip wasn't yet used. As we said, the program was called Operation Overcast. It would turn into Paperclip about 8 months later. As you know, there'd already been a lot of talk about hiring Nazis, but the plan hadn't yet been properly formalized. The British were told about it, but not to the full extent. The American public would eventually know about it, but they'd be told very little, and what they did hear would be whitewashed information. An updated Nazi exploitation list was drawn up. The first part included rocket specialists, arguably the most important Germans, including Nazis and possible war criminals. 115 had been chosen to go to the US first. The British had a similar program, Operation Backfire, in which some of the captured German scientists would help the Brits with V-2 rocket development. Arthur Rudolph worked with the Brits but soon went over to the Americans. The British still wanted to execute some of the Germans, including Walter Dornberger. They promised the Americans that after they'd used the German scientists, they would send them to the US, but they kept Dornberger. Major Staver later said, "The British pulled a sneaky on us." They only kept him briefly though, and Dornberger went to the US under Paperclip, as did von Braun, who also did a stint with the Brits. He and other rocket scientists landed in the US in September, bypassing customs. Some of them were taken to Fort Strong, an island off Boston Harbor. If the weather was good, they played volleyball outside. If the weather was bad, often thick fog covered the island, they played the board game Monopoly, which they called the Capitalists' game. More Nazis were needed, and it was then decided if backgrounds needed scrubbing, then so be it. Annie Jacobson wrote, "The fact that the scientists happened to be Nazis was incidental. It had no bearing on the bigger plan." They got to work changing the wording of previous documents, getting rid of the parts that stated that they couldn't hire a known or alleged war criminal or a, quote, ardent Nazi. For the program to work and to get ahead of the Soviets, such matters had to be sidestepped. But this wasn't just about beating the Soviets, it was also about knowledge that could be turned into money. Reports stated that by hiring these Nazis, American businesses could be opened using German technology. These scientists would help bolster the US's post-war prosperity, said reports. It was a win for the military and a win for the people. That's what the public would be told. These wizards of German science and industry were good for the country, was how the narrative went. But many Americans wouldn't buy it. The shipment of rocket men were taken to Wright Field and housed in a special area. You won't be surprised to learn that most US soldiers did not welcome the newcomers with open arms, and the Germans weren't exactly confident to go and make friends with the men that they'd been trying to murder for a few years. Anyway, they were kept separated as much as possible. The man the Germans went through if they had problems was the Air Force's Lieutenant General Donald L. Putt. And boy, did they have problems. They didn't exactly enjoy their early days in the USA, despite the fact they were getting paid $12,480 a year, about $200,000 in today's money, a great wage packet. Because of an oversight, they also paid nothing in taxes, not for almost 3 years. They had their rooms cleaned for them, their meals cooked, and their laundry delivered. They were all scientists or specialists, so they walked around with an ID with an S printed on it. They were still prisoners, just well-paid prisoners. They weren't allowed to leave the base on their own, and there was a gate around their compound that was locked at 5 p.m. and opened at 7 a.m. On weekends, they were allowed out to the local YMCA. The Americans tried to make them as comfortable as possible. Each German was handed a leaflet that explained, "We have tried to make you comfortable in the quarters assigned to you." One of the main issues was that in Nazi Germany, these men were rock stars, loved by Hitler himself. At Wright Airfield, they walked past American soldiers and all they got were snarls and hisses. They were hated by many, which was to be expected. Colonel Putt tried to make their lives easier. He had a great respect for the scientific brain and seemed to have been a realist about winning the Cold War. Putt had picked most of these guys himself, but since the program was still highly classified, he couldn't allow the Germans to chat with the American soldiers too much. It created a sense that they trapped mice in an American laboratory. In a report now declassified, they told Putt they felt like caged animals. Putt tried to help them, writing to the Pentagon that they couldn't keep full-grown men under lock and key forever. The Pentagon said those men were lucky to have a job. And anyway, the Nuremberg trials were beginning. This was no time to have Nazis running around an airbase or a town. What's kind of amusing is Wright Airfield allowed the public to enter and look at the captured German weapons, including the incredible V-2 rocket. Little did those people know, 500,000 of them, that the geniuses who made them were holed up in a compound only a few minutes away. John C. Green, the Commerce Department representative for the JIOA, had other plans. He said, why not bring all the best German scientists and let them bring their families? He said the men could work for some of the U.S.'s biggest chemical, pharmaceutical, and arms companies, and many new jobs would surely be created. Unsurprisingly, there were objections back in Washington. Having former Nazi Party men and their German-speaking kids running around American neighborhoods was, well, a bit too soon. Then Green, through Henry Wallace, U.S. Secretary of Commerce, wrote that 60 million jobs could be created if these Germans were allowed in. They were always referred to as Germans, not Nazis. The American public became more aware of Nazi medical atrocities when the Washington Post ran the headline, "Army uncovers lurid science of freezing men." It looked like a major scoop, but as was so often the case, the U.S. government, in this case the War Department, had purposefully leaked the news. The CIA would later be able to control news narratives to some extent under Operation Mockingbird, and also because Allen Dulles had rich friends who owned the media. The public often heard what they were supposed to hear, but there were always intrepid journalists who would contradict such narratives. The government wanted public support for the Nuremberg trials. The public heard for the first time that people had been frozen to death. There had been many kinds of experiments, they heard. What the Washington Post didn't say, the part that wasn't leaked, is the fact that some of the torturers were in American custody and could soon be working in the U.S. The Post story said all but one person involved with the freezing experiments was dead, which was blatant fake news, although it may not have known that. In fact, several of the Nazi chemists and aviation scientists who tortured and murdered either directly or indirectly were now in the employ of the USA at Army Air Force's Aero Medical Center, the secret research facility in Heidelberg. One of them was Strughold, but there were many other problematic prisoners at the site. In 1999, the New York Times wrote an obituary for Dr. Theodore H. Benzinger, a reported pioneering medical researcher in aviation who died at the age of 94 in a retirement home in Bethesda. He'd been working in the U.S. since 1947. Since then, had done a lot of great things in the U.S. in terms of furthering science. The Times obituary said nothing about his past. Well, not much other than he was a German and, quote, came to the United States in 1947 and was naturalized in 1955. It's uncertain what the Times knew about Benzinger's Nazism. That story even then was still being covered up by the military. The U.S. intelligence dossier about him after the war said he was self-serving and willing to get what he wants by any means. The Times piece didn't mention the part about Benzinger being an avid Nazi who joined the Nazi Party the year Hitler took power, 1933, and that he'd been a member of the SA, the Nazi stormtroopers. The Washington Post and The Guardian in the UK also wrote nothing in their obituaries about Dr. Benzinger once being a very dedicated Nazi. As we said, they didn't know because it had been covered up. Still, the news stories about Benzinger have never been updated. He'd flown missions over the UK during the war and was awarded the Iron Cross Class 1 and 2. You couldn't get much more Nazi than Mr. Benzinger. He was even a member of the National Socialist People's Welfare, NSV, which was related to financially helping out the Germans, but only if they were of the Aryan race. The organization promoted the Nazi belief in their own brand of white supremacy. It was run by propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels. This doesn't mean that Benzinger wasn't a brilliant man. He clearly was. But his background had indeed been wiped. The stories about him said nothing about the fact that he'd once been thrown into the Nuremberg jail to face trials for war crimes. Annie Jacobson wrote on Twitter that Benzinger's Nazi war crimes were so deeply buried by the US government that news media had no idea who this man actually was. Even today, despite Jacobson's research, his Wikipedia page says little about his Nazism, but it does state that he once took part in a conference on distress at sea and winter distress, where someone gave a lecture on the hypothecation experiments in the Dachau concentration camp. These were likely the freezing experiments. Siegfried Ruff, who we mentioned earlier, was also at Heidelberg. Like Benzinger, Ruff had been a full-on dedicated Nazi. He also experimented on people at Dachau. He was acquitted of war crimes and crimes against humanity for conducting medical atrocities in the camps, but he was there when it was happening. Working under Ruff was Konrad Schaefer, who'd worked on the effects of G-force and conducted ugly experiments on human thirst. The Nazis knew exactly how long humans could go without water because they were at liberty to test that on prisoners. Unlike his colleagues, who also worked for the US, Schaefer had never joined the Nazi Party. The Nazis had once put up a reward. Anyone who could come up with a way to solve a puzzle of being able to drink seawater without it killing you would be treated as a national hero. Schaefer was the one to claim the reward. Some of you might already know about the Nazis' notorious seawater experiments in which they killed prisoners by making them drink it. Schaefer, under IG Farben, discovered a solution, mixing the seawater with a tablet containing barium and silver zeolite. The question is, did he kill people in his research? He likely did. He had worked with Dr. Hermann Becker-Freising, another war criminal who'd end up in the US. Becker-Freising, who Strughold had hired, was found guilty of crimes against humanity for his medical experiments with seawater and high altitude. In a letter to Himmler that survived the war, he'd asked for 40 prisoners to test on, which would involve injecting seawater into their veins. The paper, Thirst and Thirst Quenching in Emergency Situations at Sea, revealed that half the subjects died immediately. The other half were given an experimental drug called Bercatit, and as they lay dying, they were also given a liver biopsy without anesthetic. The very toxic drug killed them all. His co-author was Schaefer. At the start of 1946, there were already 160 Nazi scientists working in the US, and 115 of them were rocket guys, some of them now at Fort Bliss in Texas. The cream of the crop was Werner von Braun. All of the Nazis stayed in a 2-story barracks, and throughout the day they worked in a lab that had once been a hospital. Von Braun was a very happy man, living through what he believed was a North American adventure. Many of the Germans were much happier in Texas than the Germans at Wright Field. They were happy to make the 80-mile journey to White Sands Missile Range, where in April of that year they launched their first V-2 missile in the US. Von Braun at this point was treated like a miracle that had been delivered to the US in a kind of bureaucratic version of Immaculate Conception. The rocket went slightly off course, but von Braun was confident in his abilities. He wrote a letter to the Los Alamos director, the now renowned so-called father of the atomic bomb, Robert Oppenheimer. Von Braun told Oppenheimer he had an idea. In the note, which was more like a proposal, he wrote the title, Use of Atomic Warheads in Projected Missiles. He said he could build a rocket that could travel for around 1,000 miles while carrying a 2,000-pound nuclear payload. From 1946 to 1952, the Nazi scientists led the V-2 missile program and launched 67 in total at White Sands. The technology behind these missiles would lead to the development of the US's Redstone and Saturn V rockets. It wasn't all plain sailing, and there would always be doubts in certain circles about if the Nazis still embraced Nazi ideology. When there were accidents, some people wondered if these German scientists were fully committed to the USA. One such accident was the Hermes 2 incident, when an out-of-control missile landed near the city of Ciudad Juarez in Mexico and made a crater 50 feet in width and 24 feet deep. Luckily, it didn't hit the densely populated university apartments nearby. Had that happened, the US would have had a serious international incident to deal with. One of the German scientists later joked, "We were the first German unit to not only infiltrate the United States, but to attack Mexico from US soil." In memos, it was stated that the US had to bring in more of what they called rare mines. The Air Documents Research Center, which had previously been in London, was moved to Wright Field along with 500 staff that went through mountains of documents that the Brits and the Americans had taken from Germany under Alsace. Around 1,000 new technical words were added to the center's dictionary of terms. The Nazis, while seemingly happier in Texas, still complained a lot at Wright Field over in Ohio. The Nazi businessman and armaments contractor Albert Patton was the go-between for the German scientists and Colonel Putt. They said their barracks, known as the Hilltop, was a terrible place to live. They said the nearby city of Dayton was not civilized, so there was nowhere to go when they were let out. The mail, they said, was too slow, and it took too long to contact their loved ones. They said the lab facilities at Wright Field were Stone Age compared to what they worked in back in Germany. In a report, Putt wrote that the Germans were starting to lose trust and faith in the Americans for broken promises. Putt knew very well that even a man like Patton was of extreme value. It was in Patton's armaments factories where he had the vision to mass-produce much of the Luftwaffe's onboard technology. Putt was aware that Patton had used slave labor. One day, Patton told Putt that he'd used thousands of slaves, thanks mostly to Himmler, but he said he treated them better than most. He said he just followed orders, denying he'd been a war profiteer. He talked to Putt about his great summer vacations with the Goring family and the fact that he'd gone on skiing holidays with the family of Albert Speer's munitions procurement guy. Putt trusted Patton and asked him to take notes of the general mood in the German camp, and if issues were bubbling up, report back to him. There were issues, said Patton. Many of the men missed their families back home. Some were so depressed they had lost the will to live. Patton then wrote to General John Samford at Air Force HQ in Washington, future head of the NSA, stating that if something wasn't done about German morale, there was going to be problems. Samford then wrote to the War Department saying, "Immediate action in the situation is imperative if we are to divert the services of valuable scientists from France or Russia to the United States." He said that if the U.S. made life easy for the Germans, those scientists would want to come to the U.S. Some had been going over to the Soviet zone in Berlin. The Joint Chiefs warned that if something wasn't done to stop this, the Soviets would soon catch up to the Americans in the fields of atomic research and guided missiles. They almost already had. It would be 2 more years until the Americans learned that one of the Manhattan Project's most important scientists, the German theoretical physicist Klaus Fuchs, had been working all the time as a spy for the Soviets. The Americans were also concerned that the Soviets had also spirited away German chemical and biological weapons experts. No more, it was said, could go over to the other side. It was decided at the top, effective immediately, there should be a plan to bring the families of the German scientists over to the USA. A memo said that visa issues should be sorted out in any way possible. It was decided to bring another 1,000 Germans over as soon as possible. If there were background check traffic jams, they should be overcome. The whole process, it was said, had to be sped up in the national interest. If the Germans had been dedicated Nazis, this was now less important than another matter, which was, do the Russians want them? Even so, the Americans couldn't just ignore all the red tape. The State Department didn't want to approve full-on Nazi ideologues. Some of the men on the list had won awards from the Nazi Party. They'd been cherished by Adolf Hitler. They'd been SS and SA. Army intelligence had a simple fix for this rather concerning matter. They'd look at the Office of Military Government for Germany, OMGUS reports, and if needed, there were some very sketchy cases containing information about dedicated Nazis. Then a paperclip should be attached to that report. This was to be done discreetly. What that paperclip meant, to those who knew it, was that those special reports were to not be sent to the State Department. Hence, this is where Operation Overcast became Operation Paperclip. Intelligence said, bring these men in, but keep an eye on them more than the others. The JIOA also changed the language as to who was allowed to be hired by the Americans. It used to be no known or alleged war criminals and no active Nazis, which, as you know, made up quite a few Nazis who were hired. The JIOA said change this to no persons who might try and plan for the resurgence of German military potential. To say the least, this opened things up. President Truman was handed plenty of reports that stated that the Soviets believed war with the US was inevitable. He was told peaceful coexistence between the communist and capitalist nations is impossible. Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947 into law, and that's when we got the modern CIA. Years later, after the CIA branched out and started assassination campaigns and overthrowing democratically elected leaders, Truman said, "I never would have agreed to the formulation of the Central Intelligence Agency back in '47 if I had known it would become the American Gestapo." The communist threat was imminent, or so Truman was told. He was informed by Undersecretary of the State Department Dean Acheson that if he didn't act fast, many German scientists who could help keep America safe would be lost to us. That was when he officially approved the program and said if you have to expedite things, so be it. The Nazis were coming, lots of them, and this wasn't going to be a temporary thing as it was supposed to be in the past. Bring in these Nazis and keep them was the plan. Bring their families, pay them well, give them nice houses, not dirty barracks where they live under lock and key. The Joint Intelligence Committee wrote that there would likely be complete and total hostilities unrestricted in any way on the Soviet part by adherence to any international convention or humanitarian principles. The threat was real, but things were sometimes overblown for certain political motives and various strategic considerations. Little did the president, or much of the government for that matter, know that the CIA was preparing to embark on decades-long projects that, it was later reported, ignored international convention or humanitarian principles. For the CIA, this was what the Soviets were doing, and if they didn't do the same, they would lose the Cold War. Let's now talk again about Kurt Blome, who you already know headed biological warfare for the Nazis and would work with the CIA. He was as bad as they came. A Nazi party ideologue from the early days. With Himmler, he worked on chemical and biological weapons that could be used against Britain, the Soviet Union, and the US. You name it, plague, typhoid, cholera, anthrax, they could be used and could be dropped on civilian populations from New York to London to Moscow. Hitler had an aversion to such weapons, but the Nazis had them ready to go. These weapons first needed testing on prisoners, and that's when Himmler told Blome to start doing just that. Blome worked on prisoners with nerve agents. He collaborated with Japanese scientists at the dreaded Unit 731, where human experiments were also conducted. There, a man named Shiro Ishii conducted live vivisections. The Japanese did things at Unit 731 that were very similar to what was happening in Germany. The writer, Stephen Kinzer, author of books on the CIA, wrote, Ishii wanted to see how to make people suffer and how they die under various sorts of excruciating torture. So he had Japanese soldiers simply rounding people up in the countryside. The Americans decided, we don't want to hang this guy, we want to hire him. After the war, the U.S. intelligence agents would find Ishii. He'd lead them to his secret stash of files, which detailed the horrors of what he'd done at Unit 731. The U.S. helped him avoid war crimes prosecution. Ishii would end up teaching Americans at Fort Detrick about bioweapons. Such was the Cold War. But there was little chance that men like Blome and Ishii could pick up U.S. visas and payrolls out in the open. That was a bridge too far. Still, in terms of developing biological weapons, these men were very much at the top of the U.S.'s list. The U.S. had its own secret biological weapons program at Camp Detrick. There, they also made germ bombs and researched ways to spread anthrax and animal diseases, which was almost as secret as the Manhattan Project. With Blome's and Ishii's help, this program was about to be expanded. The good thing about biological weapons, if you can say there's anything good about them, was that they could be developed at relatively little cost without any elaborate facilities. You could also hide them in plain sight. Merck's pro-biological weapon report stated, you could develop them under the guise of conducting bacteriological research. The Americans got a shock during the Nuremberg trials when, during the 10th month of the proceedings, the Soviets produced a new witness in the trial. Karl Blome was not the defendant, but his name came up. The witness was someone you'll remember, Walter Schreiber, the shield to Blome's sword. Now the Soviets were using a top German scientist to testify against a top scientist the Americans dearly wanted to work for them. Schreiber told the court that after the Nazis were beaten at Stalingrad in that bloody, vicious battle that flattened the city and led to an estimated 1.2 million deaths, the Germans planned to launch a biological attack. So far in the trial, biological attacks had not been mentioned. The U.S. had not been made aware that Schreiber was going to drop this bombshell. Schreiber was one of the Third Reich's highest-ranked doctors. He was the commanding officer at the Military Medical Academy in Berlin. At the trial, he said he once refused to allow Blome to conduct plague experiments, but Himmler had overruled him. He said he always had been against using bacteria-based weapons. He'd opened up a small hospital when Berlin was still smoldering, and that's how the Soviets got hold of him. Until the trial, no one had known what had happened to Schreiber, not even his own family. He'd apparently gotten the KGB treatment at the infamous Lubyanka KGB HQ, a prison that was a palace of screams, later known for long, brutal interrogations. The Americans, of course, had Schreiber on their Nazi war criminal lists. He was one of the standout names on the Army's Central Registry of War Criminals. The fact that he was now in court giving testimony was perhaps a little strange. Had the Americans gotten hold of him, he may well have not been a witness, but in the dock himself with the rope not far away. Goes without saying that Blome should have too. I swear by the God Almighty and Omniscient that I will speak the pure truth and will withhold nothing and add nothing, said Schreiber when he was on the stand. This didn't look good for Blome. Schreiber said that the Nazis had been preparing for a biological weapons attack, and in order to practice such an attack, they had used subhuman prisoners as medical rabbits. He spoke of such experiments being carried out at the Institute in Posen, which happened to be where Blome had been in charge. He said that he had meetings with Blome. You have to ask why Schreiber was bringing up Kurt Blome. Blome wasn't the one on trial. Was this perhaps because the Russians knew the Americans had Blome, and Mr. Blome was like the biological weapons equivalent of von Braun to rocket science? Schreiber spilled his guts, mentioning a number of Nazis involved in human experimentation, from bacteriological weapons to freezing experiments. Some of these men were paperclip guys. So as things stood, the man the Americans wanted was a war criminal, and the guy the Soviets had wasn't. Was someone lying? Remember, the KGB had interrogated Schreiber at Lubyanka. As the writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn outlined in his book, The Gulag Archipelago, an interrogation by the Soviets was anyone's worst nightmare. If the torture didn't make someone speak, the sound of a screaming wife in the next room would make even the most resilient prisoner do exactly as he was told. Had the Soviets ordered Schreiber to set Blome up? While the Nuremberg trials were all about justice, the Americans and the Soviets were locked into an intricate power game. We'll discuss what happened to both Schreiber and Blome in a minute, but for now we'll just say that 2 days after Schreiber's testimony, Blome was taken from his job working with the Americans and locked up in the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. He was scratched off the paperclip list, but his American adventure wasn't quite over. The Americans had another matter to deal with. On September 17, 1946, the 58 Nazi doctors working for them at Heidelberg had been arrested. The CIC 303 detachment had turned up in the middle of the day with a wad of arrest warrants. Some of the aviation doctors we mentioned, Ruff, Schaefer, Becker-Freising, and more, were wanted for war crimes. They had to face the doctor's trial, just as Blome would. Not only was conducting medical research in Germany illegal, but if it became public knowledge that the Americans had hired Nazis who were now accused war criminals, well, you can only imagine how that would sound back home or in the rest of Europe. Operation Paperclip would likely have exploded, and the USA would have been on trial in the court of public opinion, or possibly even the international courts. When the doctor's trial began on December 9th, the 23 defendants were not all household names like some of the Nazis in the Nuremberg trial. 7 men were eventually acquitted, 7 got the death sentence. The others were given prison sentences from 10 years to life. This was when the world learned much more about human experiments: freezing, high altitude, malaria, organ removal, seawater, noxious gases, sterilization, and mass euthanasia. It was reported that some prisoners, Slavs and Jews, had been murdered for nothing more than to produce skeletons that were needed at a medical college. We won't go into details about each defendant, but we will say that some men seemed to get off lucky. Benzinger, the one with the glowing future obituaries in the West, was supposed to have been a defendant, but his name was suddenly struck from the list. Decades later, it was revealed that the U.S. Army had pulled some strings to get him off, because he'd been working on high-altitude research of vital importance. This was a man who would later help the U.S. send men higher and faster than ever before. The truth about him would later become available through the Freedom of Information Act, not because the government wanted to release the information. Other war criminals were acquitted, including Blome, whose promise to teach American scientists about his biological warfare experiments was kept. The truth was, Blome had frozen inmates to death. He injected them with mescaline and cut open people to watch the gangrene slowly kill them. In other words, he was useful. He would eventually be hired by MKUltra chief Stanley Gottlieb, where ironically Blome and U.S. intelligence agents would breach the Nuremberg Code by injecting substances, sometimes lethal, into prisoners in European CIA safe houses. Siegfried Ruff and Konrad Schaefer also got off and went over to the U.S., while Becker-Freising had his sentence commuted. He went to the U.S. in the 1950s. Some of the leading Nazis responsible for the Holocaust were indeed hanged after the trials, but others with blood on their hands were shipped off with their families in tow. This would have caused outrage, but of course it was secret. The New York Times got wind of Paperclip after a journalist in the Russian zone of Berlin tipped off a Times journalist. The public had heard hundreds of Nazis were already living comfortably in the US, and 1,000 additional German scientists were on their way. After the Times article, Newsweek explained that the program was called Operation Paperclip. The articles that followed said the Germans were under contract, but could apply for citizenship later. The army propagandists soon got busy, releasing photographs of smart German men who they said were definitely benign in nature. According to the army, one of the Germans was merely working with Goodyear to make a new blimp. The army posted a photo of the German aeronautical engineer Alexander Lippisch and explained that he was just a great scientist who designed planes. The article said nothing about the fact that his designs had beaten records in shooting down Allied aircraft, but it did mention that his planes had broken speed records. An engineer and another brilliant scientist, Ernst R.G. Eckert, made an appearance on US TV. Today, his Wikipedia page says nothing about the fact that he was a Nazi ideologue and a member of the SS and the SA. And this was also left out when he did his interview in front of millions of Americans in 1946. An American officer appeared in an interview and smiling said these Germans were great. "I wish we had more of them," he chimed in. A man they kept well away from the cameras was Emil Zaman, one of a few SS men who were now in the States. Zaman's intelligence file stated that he once burned down a synagogue. The same file said his aircraft expertise was difficult, if not impossible, to replicate. The media published photographs of nice-looking German men playing chess with each other or sitting back in the sun reading a book. The Germans with facial dueling scars were kept out of sight. Stars and Stripes magazine informed Americans that not one of these scientists had ever been Nazis, which, as you know, was very, very far from the truth. They were vital to national security, people heard, so Paperclip was accepted by some of the U.S. public. Still, a Gallup poll revealed that most Americans believed bringing German scientists to the U.S. was a bad idea, and this was based on the lie that these men hadn't been Nazis, never mind war criminals. The Nation newspaper didn't pull its punches, though, writing that if you wanted to get away with murder as a German scientist, you just had to come to America. The American Jewish Congress's Rabbi Stephen Wise was also not surprisingly upset, writing to the War Department that servants of Hitler should not have been welcomed into the U.S. He too had no idea about the full extent of these Germans' backgrounds. Matters were made worse for the military when a professor at Syracuse University wrote in the Times that his new colleague, an infrared expert, was a full-blown Nazi. He wrote that some of the others in the program probably still are Nazis. Soon, articles appeared in anti-war magazines that talked about how the U.S. was now home to men who'd built gas chambers and crematoriums and had come up with ways to extract gold teeth from Jews. Let's now fill in some gaps about other leading Nazis that went into the U.S. A man you can easily find information about online is Georg Rickhey, who led some of those massive underground tunnel projects for the Nazis. A document written by the Army's Office of the Deputy Director of Intelligence said Rickhey had been in charge of building Hitler's HQ in Berlin, the Führer bunker. The Army was so impressed with Rickhey's bunker building abilities and the fact that his bunkers had remained intact during heavy Allied bombing that they got Rickhey to explain how he'd done it. Several new tunnel complexes were later built around the U.S. Back at Hilltop, Rickhey and Patton figured out how to make an extra buck when they started selling black market cigarettes and booze. They also ran rowdy card tables at the complex, which became too much for the scientist Herman Nelson, who went to Colonel Putt and told him that the noisy and drunk Rickhey character was a full-on war criminal. It was true. Not only had Rickhey used slave labor to build a Mittelwerk mine, but one time he hanged 12 prisoners from a crane. Nelson told Putt that Rickhey had bragged about it. Another witness said the prisoners had revolted after reading pamphlets dropped from British planes telling them to refuse orders. Little did Rickhey know that war crimes investigators in the U.S. had been looking for him. The investigators were unaware that he was part of Paperclip. On May 19, 1947, an arrest warrant was issued for Rickhey. The problem was, if it became known that a war criminal had been sent back to Germany from the U.S., it would not look good that he'd been in the employ of the American Army. On June 2, 1947, the JIOA wrote to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover saying that the case for Rickhey should be dropped. It wasn't. On August 7, 1947, Rickhey stood with 19 other men charged with the deaths of at least 20,000 slave laborers, and for the charge of slavery itself. It was said that these people had been tortured, starved, hanged, or worked to death, all to build V-2 rockets. Von Braun was supposed to testify, but he was so valuable that the Army didn't want him to go to Germany. Von Braun's role using slave labor has always been a touchy topic, given that he became one of the most admired scientists in the USA because of his NASA work. As for Rickhey, he was acquitted, but it was in the interest of the U.S., according to a memo, that he stay out of the U.S. for good. Even so, Dornberger, who when in British custody had been called a menace and deceitful, was brought over to Wright Field as a rocket specialist. The British, who believed Dornberger was a criminal, had secretly recorded him. They showed the Americans the tapes, and the Americans also said that this man was definitely not to be trusted. A report stated that Dornberger had been trying to turn ally against ally. His manipulation tactics were no secret, but the fact was he was good at building rockets. He had to stay, no matter what. As you know, he had a lot of people killed, including those Dutch prostitutes. It was later written that the Americans put up with his anti-democratic attitude and endorsement of totalitarianism, which he didn't make a secret of. He even told the Americans that if they wanted to get ahead of the Soviets, they should adopt his hardcore totalitarian attitude. It seemed that in some cases you could take the Nazi out of Germany, but you couldn't take the Nazi out of the man. This is what had always been feared, that the U.S. was possibly biting off more than it could chew, and sooner or later this whole Nazi hiring plan would backfire. Some of these men now working in the U.S. had indeed really believed that a subhuman race of people should be wiped out of the planet. Soon, the great Albert Einstein came out and wrote a letter to Truman stating that these Nazis should not be able to hold key positions in American industrial, scientific, and educational institutions. Einstein didn't know the half of it. Still, many academics came forward and said things such as, do we really need science at any price? The fact was, the Nazis had been monetized, and there was no way the genies were going to be put back into the bottle. Not while the Pentagon was constantly talking about total war that was just around the corner. One report after the other shone a new light on Nazi depravity that had been previously hidden. Take, for instance, Herbert Axter, a patent lawyer who'd worked with Dornberger on the V2. He and his wife had about 40 slaves working for them at their personal estate. It was discovered through testimonies that the couple had been particularly sadistic when dealing with prisoners. Mrs. Axter was said to have enjoyed taking prisoners out into the garden and whipping them. She'd been a member of the National Socialist Women's League, and as a teacher, she taught German children about German identity as Hitler saw it. Critics among the U.S. public said the War Department's screening was a farce, and that the U.S. was hiring just about anyone. Even though the Axters were by no means the worst, not even close, they became a lightning rod in the public debates about German scientists. It didn't hold them back. The Axters ended up opening a law firm in Wisconsin. The War Department admitted that it was true a few ardent Nazis might have slipped through the cracks. That was an understatement. Some of these men were just not ardent, they were leading Nazis. They hadn't slipped through the cracks, they walked through an open door. Despite the commendable job of American investigators who were looking into the background of these Nazis. Kurt Diebus also entered the U.S. through an open door. The man would go on to design and direct the development, construction, and operation of NASA's Saturn launch facilities. He would have a moon crater named after him, and do so much good work that one day there would be a Kurt Diebus Conference Center at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex. It's still there today. Diebus was undoubtedly a very talented scientist. He was the first ever director of NASA's Launch Operations Center after launching the first U.S. ballistic missile, the Redstone, in 1953. He later launched the first tests of missiles loaded with atomic warheads in the Pacific Ocean and pioneered much of the U.S.'s space program launches. For his work, he was awarded the U.S. Army's highest civilian decoration, the Exceptional Civilian Service Medal. But Diebus had secrets. He had lots of them. He'd been in the SS and the SA and had been a Nazi ideologue many years before he got into the American Space Hall of Fame. He was such an ideologue that he wore his Nazi uniform to work when he was supposed to wear civilian clothes. Worse, his intelligence security report said that he'd once ratted on a colleague, Richard Kramer, for making what he said were anti-Nazi comments and criticizing Hitler. He told the Gestapo that this insolent colleague had also refused to do the Nazi salute. The intelligence file showed how Diebus had taken it upon himself to write a full report about it to the Gestapo. Kramer was charged with treason. On April 5, 1942, he was dragged into a special Nazi court, known as the Sondergericht. He got 2 years in prison because of Diebus's report. In 2024, the word Nazi is often bandied about as a criticism of people, arguably a little too liberally at times. Diebus, who has gone down in NASA history, was an actual Nazi. The Nazi's Nazi. And it was only mentioned in passing at the side of his NASA accomplishments, of which it's true there were many. The government did consider something about Diebus, but because he was leading the US's guided missile program, it was written that despite his political background, he had to stay in the interests of national security. The Nazi thing became known as an elephant in the room as the years passed. It was a similar situation for von Braun, who, as you know, had attended a meeting and asked for more slaves that he would personally pick at the concentration camp. Even so, these rocket men had nothing to do with the biological and chemical scientists. The first of the chemical guys to arrive in the U.S. was Friedrich Fritz Hoffmann, who got there as part of Paperclip in 1947. He was known to have been one of the top Nazi scientists in the area of nerve gases. There were various reports circulating about Hoffmann. The State Department acknowledged that he was one of the leading scientists regarding the synthesis of tabun. But rather than be a Nazi's Nazi like Diebus, he was said to have been an anti-Nazi. Now, this was a man the U.S. could work with and not have to worry about what might come out. Hoffmann had carried around a signed document from a consul general in Switzerland that stated that he was indeed anti-Nazi and his father had once spied for the Americans. After an army interrogation, he was deemed, quote, fit for exploitation and sent packing over to the U.S. He arrived at Edgewood Arsenal in February 1947. He soon started synthesizing chemical weapons under a highly classified program. The U.S.'s Chemical Corps had intel that told them the Soviets were already ahead in this regard. The Soviets had captured chemical weapons specialist Dr. von Bock, who intelligence said was now working with his entire team at the Soviets' Chemical Works No. 91. It was hoped that Hoffmann would speed things up for the Americans. The man the Americans really wanted was Otto Ambros, but he'd been sentenced to 8 years for war crimes. Karl Crouch, who the Americans also had their eye on, was stuck in the same fix, as were many other top IG Farben chemical men. Many of the best guys were simply unavailable, but something would soon happen that made them available much sooner than was expected. There were also ways to test chemicals outside of the law. Annie Jacobson, who we mentioned a lot because she's the one who's written the most comprehensive work about Paperclip, said the CIA was the perfect agency for Paperclip. The CIA didn't seem to have limits and often worked outside of the law. Some MKUltra documents that survived the CIA's destruction attempt noted how prisoners might die in chemical or drug experiments, but to not worry about disposal. These experiments would include drugs such as LSD and amphetamines, but also more toxic compounds. The LSD experiments would eventually be secretly conducted on U.S. citizens. The CIA even had prostitutes put LSD in their customers' drinks as CIA agents watched through two-way mirrors. In other U.S.-based experiments, small amounts of tabun were tested on American soldiers at Edgewood. They were said to have been volunteers, although they had no idea that they were going to be given nerve gas. The British famously did something similar at the Porton Down Labs, which The Guardian later called one of the darkest hours of British military history. Young soldiers died when the Brits tested sarin on them without their knowledge. The Guardian wrote hundreds are suspected of dying prematurely or going on to develop illnesses such as cancer, motor neuron disease, and Parkinson's. Famously, the top MKUltra scientist, Frank Olson, who may or may not have been thrown out of a hotel window by the CIA agents or assets in 1953, saw a young man die in England after sarin had been wiped on his skin. A British man who later testified to such experiments described what he saw like this. It was like he'd been electrocuted. His whole body was convulsing. I have seen somebody suffer an epileptic fit, but you have never seen anything like what happened to that lad. The skin was vibrating, and there was all this terrible stuff coming out of his mouth. It looked like frog spawn or tapioca. 3,000 young British men were sent to the gas chamber at Porton Down, mostly thinking they were taking a medicine that could cure the common cold. Some tested sarin, some tested mustard gas, and others tested various blistering agents. The government and the Department of Defense denied it for decades. In the U.S., about 7,000 young men were used for what's now called the Edgewood Arsenal human experiments. This included mustard gas, sarin, and many other chemicals and drugs, including LSD and PCP. Like in the UK, there were long-term toxic effects on the men's bodies, and also some serious mental issues. It's thought that no one died. What's often not said is how Nazis played their part in such experiments. In the documentary film Dr. Delirium about the Edgewood experiments, Dr. James Ketchum, who took part, said he worked alongside Nazi talent who'd been hired for their experience and expertise. Guys such as Fritz Hoffmann were certainly a part of the tests on young American soldiers. It was Dr. L. Wilson Green, one of the men who later proposed psychochemical warfare, who led the testing. Green was sure that you could win wars without firing a bullet. He once wrote, "I'm convinced that it is possible by means of the techniques of psychochemical warfare to conquer an enemy without the wholesale killing of his people and the mass destruction of his property." This is partly why some researchers believe the CIA was behind the Pont Saint-Esprit mass poisoning in France in 1951, when a whole town suddenly started seeing monsters jumping out of second-floor windows, tearing at their eyes, and in general doing the craziest things you've probably ever heard. Indeed, one of the drugs the Americans tested on people was BZ, said to cause delirium with ultra-vivid hallucinations where animals, as in France, might appear out of nowhere, or people think they've shrunk to the size of a small child. The CIA and American chemical weapons experts, including Olson, were in France when it happened. Mr. Green wrote that he knew of 61 substances that could be dropped on people that would cause mental abnormalities of military significance. They would cause mental disorders, he said. He got to work with Hoffman on researching the best chemicals that cause madness or incapacitation. They found hallucinogens as far away as Mongolia. They wrote that they discovered similar drugs in Venezuela, Brazil, and Colombia that would cause severe hallucinations. Declassified documents show the CIA wanted to create drugs that with hypnosis could make a man act against his own will, against his own morality, and perhaps purposefully crash a train or a plane and also kill an important person. They wanted to know if they could make a man assassinate a government leader and then remember nothing after he'd done it. They also wanted chemicals that could incapacitate and kill, and these needed to be tested. This is where Bloma and Schreiber once again come in. They hadn't been sent to the US yet, but they worked with US agents in Germany, where prisoners were completely expendable. At a black site in Poland known as Villa Schuster, the CIA tested the most toxic drugs in its arsenal. Here, Germans and Russians were interrogated to the edge of death or death. One of the men who helped them was none other than Walter Schreiber, who had avoided prosecution despite the Polish government saying he conducted gruesome medical experiments at Auschwitz. We also now know with the Nazis, he devised something called the Nourishment program, in which he fed slave laborers not broth or bread, but a paste he'd concocted. Out of 150 laborers who were fed just that for 6 months, 50 died. The paste was nothing but cellulose and used clothing. An army report on him said he is well known to the Soviets and is desired by them. His exploitation in the United States is therefore highly desirable. We should add again that some found it strange that this man had managed to escape the notorious Soviet prison, the Lubyanka. That seemed almost implausible. They asked if he was now a double agent. Schreiber somehow managed to sneak into the American zone in Berlin. The JIOA said that given his notoriety, his name should be changed, and he should undergo denazification before entering the US. The Air Force didn't want him in the US, so for the time being he stayed in Germany. The Air Force had found out that Schreiber was actually a top-ranking Nazi in the German war economy who'd profiteered from the war and had helped confiscate Jewish businesses in France. Still, he became a very useful asset for the Americans in Germany. When General Charles E. Laux, Chief of Intelligence for Chemical Warfare, hosted a dinner party, he invited Schreiber. He liked what he saw, writing that Schreiber was interesting and independent thinking, intelligent and very competent, and willing to do anything for the future of the world and Germany. Schreiber became a consultant for the Chemical Corps on 1,000 marks a month. He wrote step-by-step instructions for the US on how to mass-produce sarin. He and Laux became good friends, exchanging gifts and sending each other Christmas cards. The Pentagon later reprimanded Laux for this, to which he wrote he couldn't understand why everyone seems to have cut them, the Nazis, off. This was when Schreiber worked on interrogation and torture at Schuster, and later the notorious Camp King. Under Project Bluebird, Schreiber tested all manner of drugs with the Americans to try to control minds, incapacitate, and kill. He and Bloma both tested viruses for the Americans, but not together, it seems, in the same place. As for their expertise, a declassified memo stated, "Not all viruses have to be lethal. The objective includes those that act as short-term and long-term incapacitating agents." CIA research staff under former U.S. Army Brigadier General Paul F. Gaynor tested these drugs on prisoners in Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. In Asia, Shiro Ishii was the man who worked with the CIA on such projects. As we said, this would one day evolve and be brought back into the US, where the CIA said it would test on the weaker and less intelligent people in society. Such words, researchers later wrote, sounded a bit too close to what someone called Adolf Hitler would have said. A now infamous memo asked if it was possible to make a mind-controlled assassin murder a prominent or redacted politician, or if necessary, an American official. Schreiber, using the name Doc Fisher, became a friend of the Harvard scientist Henry Beecher, a man who wrote papers on the possibility of drugging entire towns by poisoning the water supply or using aerosols. He once wrote a poem about this happening with LSD in Toulouse, France. The two men would chat for hours over drinks about what was possible with drugs. Beecher ironically was regarded as a leader in the realm of American medical ethics. The book Poisoner-in-Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control says that these two men engaged in the most extreme torture ever taken up by the USA. The book gives plenty of examples. One of the many memos later found regarding what the US and the Nazi scientists did in Germany stated, examination at redacted clinic identified sickness, caused partial dissolution of brain tissues. Now redacted husband, redacted, is developing similar symptoms. It wasn't stated what they'd been given. The man died. The bodies began to pile up in Asia and Europe, as various memos described, which is all the more controversial because the Americans had just played a major part in writing up the Nuremberg Code. Wasn't killing prisoners and testing chemical weapons on them a crime against humanity? The hypocrisy was stunning. German and American scientists built a gas chamber at Fort Detrick that became known as the 8-ball. This 131-ton ball could contain a test subject, and the scientists could watch his reactions through small portholes. The Americans wanted Kurt Bloma, who was working in Camp Detrick, to help with this device. He'd admitted he'd been in charge of pathogens for the Nazis, but he still wouldn't admit to testing on humans. After an interview with an army bacteriologist, Harold Batchelor, Batchelor wrote, "We express our gratitude to Mr. Bloma for this wholehearted cooperation." All we know is that Batchelor returned to Detrick with many new ideas. Bloma had, it seemed, told him everything about his research. Another man in high demand was Richard Johann Kuhn, a biochemist who'd won the Nobel Prize just before the war started. Kuhn made his trip to the US, but his background was problematic. It was known he'd once denounced his Jewish co-workers and was a big supporter of Hitler's ideology. When he was the famed Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Medical Research director, he'd always start his lectures with Sieg Heil. Kuhn had developed the Soman nerve agent, said to be deadlier than Tabun and sarin, but it was difficult and costly to synthesize for mass production. On June 24, 1948, everything changed. The Soviets blocked off land and rail access to the American zone. Both countries were in a fight to find and control the best Nazis, whether scientists or spies, and the Soviets didn't want any German on their side going over to the American side. The cloak and dagger spy game throughout Europe was just beginning. Germany became a battlefield between East and West. The CIA soon got busy secretly hiring thousands of spies and saboteurs, and places like Camp King, which Annie Jacobsen called the US's most closely guarded secret, housed accused spies and other prisoners. The extreme interrogation and behavior modification programs that happened there are still somewhat unclear. For the most part, what happened at Camp King stayed at Camp King or got buried in a shallow grave nearby. One of the men who appeared at Camp King for interrogation was Reinhard Gehlen, a German intelligence officer. It's a long story, so we'll just say the Americans paid him to spy for them. He was allowed to hire many of his colleagues, some of them known war criminals. His Gehlen organization included 100 or so former Gestapo and SS officers that Gehlen had hired through the Americans. Collectively, they'd been responsible for the deaths of many thousands of Jews or other prisoners. The CIA spent $200 million on these Nazi spies, and it's now doubtful they were ever that effective. A critic said the program was a complete failure in intelligence terms. The Nazis were terrible spies. A report later stated that the Soviets had infiltrated the organization and exposed over 100 CIA staffers. That same report said the CIA ignored clear evidence of a war crimes record when it hired these Nazis. The CIA hired Baron Otto von Boschwing, who'd later be accused of massacres of Jews. He was said to be behind the deaths of 60 Jews who were found hanging on meat hooks. It was thought they'd been skinned alive. In 1981, von Boschwing was forced to give up his American citizenship. No kidding. And then there was Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Leon, who was renowned for torture and was said to have sent orphans and plenty of adults to the gas chamber. He later worked as a torturer-in-chief for Latin American dictators who were being supported by the US. Then he later worked for a drug trafficker, Roberto Gomez, the first king of cocaine. Barbie also reportedly worked in a security capacity for Pablo Escobar, another king of the devil's dandruff. For years, he was a U.S. intelligence asset hidden by the CIA, which the Justice Department had to apologize for, given he should have been hanged for his war crimes at the time the CIC was helping him escape through a rat line. It's not really part of Paperclip, so let's move on and tell you how things ended with the Nazi hires. With the start of the Korean War in 1950, the U.S. kicked off a new fast-track program called Accelerated Paperclip. Top-level Germans were to be moved out of Germany immediately with what was called a Modified Denial Program. A special projects team was sent to Germany to collect a K-list about 150 in-demand scientists. The Joint Chiefs of Staff agreed on a budget of $1 million, about $13 million in 2024, to entice these Germans to the U.S. with handsome pay packages. When the Germans arrived at a hotel for the introduction, they read a German-language brochure that sold them on the American dream. The Army's #1 concern, it said, was to provide them with comfort, contentment, happiness, and security with a minimum of friction, distraction, and delay. To everyone's surprise, many of the Germans flat out said they did not want to go, even though Germany was a mess and it was hard to find work there. The JIOA asked what the problem was, to which an officer in charge of the program said the Germans were either too old, too rich, too busy, or too thoroughly disgruntled with past experiences with Americans. They saw Germany as a country about to be rebuilt. Some of the Germans who did want to go were the worst offenders, including Otto Ambros, who didn't have much longer to serve in prison. Bloma and Schreiber were still working for the Americans at safe houses and were also added to the Accelerated Paperclip list. Some men who'd been given lengthy prison sentences were about to have their sentences reduced. It was also decided that their property and money that had been confiscated, which had been partly gained from slave labor, should be returned. This was extremely controversial. Under the orders of John J. McCloy, who you'll remember was the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany and the future president of the World Bank, 10 of 15 death sentences were commuted. This included men accused of massacring men who had run mobile extermination units. About 1/3 of the inmates, all convicted war criminals, were released, and 64 out of 74 war criminals had sentence reductions. As you could imagine, this infuriated a lot of people. General Telford Taylor, who'd been lead counsel for the prosecution in the Nuremberg trials, was irate, calling it a blow to the principles of international law. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote in a newspaper column, "Why are we freeing so many Nazis?" Why indeed? The answer was complicated, more complicated than the American public was led to believe. In West Germany, Nazis who'd murdered left prison and walked into jobs as intelligence agents. Doctors who'd experimented on humans were now free to practice medicine. Death squad killers went to work in the public service in Germany. Powerful industrialists and bankers who profited from slavery and mass death were free and would become tremendously wealthy, wealthier than ever, and very powerful. This included war criminal Hermann Schmitz, the CEO of IG Farben. This included the war criminal Kurt von Schroeder, the Nazi banker who'd been the intermediary between Nazi industrialists and Adolf Hitler. During the war, he'd been the main Nazi contact of the OSS's Allen Dulles, later the CIA chief and a friend of McCloy. Schroeder and Dulles were close. Such relationships are too complicated to get into today, but here's what a writer said about Dulles and Schroeder. Kurt von Schroeder knew the Dulles brothers well and no doubt also knew that in Allen Dulles, he had a major potential ally who could assist in freeing him or getting him a light sentence, which in the end is exactly what happened. Then there was Fritz Termier, who'd overseen the construction of Auschwitz III, and at the trials got 7 years for plunder, exploitation, and mass murder and enslavement. After his release, he became chairman of the board of directors for the pharmaceutical company Bayer AG, which soon became one of the biggest chemical and pharmaceutical corporations around the globe. McCloy's releases included the president and vice president of Reichsbank, who were also convicted of war crimes at Nuremberg. Steel baron Alfred Krupp, who made huge amounts of money on the backs of around 80,000 dead slave laborers, was one of the others who was freed. He was still insanely wealthy after his release, despite the fact that he'd made a fortune on the back of slavery and death. McCloy's decision was made in part by pressure from West Germans who wanted leniency, but it went a lot deeper than that. This is a story in its own right, so we'll keep it brief. It was said that the U.S. Army had tortured or violated the due process rights of some of these German war criminals. McCloy wanted to show the world that the U.S. was the good guy. He said he wanted to restore American justice, which was a ploy to expose the Soviet Union's use of torture, acts of terror, witness intimidation, and lies. He was right about the Soviets doing such things, but the U.S. was doing it too. The New York Times wrote many years later that the real reason, Realpolitik, went a bit deeper than that. The Korean War had started and the U.S. needed West Germany to get behind it. The U.S. wanted the world to get behind the U.S., but West Germany was important for the Americans given the communists in the East. Releasing war criminals would not only help stabilize West Germany, but the U.S. would gain the support of a lot of powerful German politicians and industrialists. The Times article asked ironically, with the fate of the West in the balance, what did a few Nazi war criminals matter? What was good, right, or moral was trumped by strategic concerns and old elite friendships. This encapsulates Operation Paperclip. What did a few war criminals matter to the U.S. if those criminals would, anyway at all, help bolster American power or the power of elites? Critics have stated that during the war, there were back channels between German banking and industry and American banking and industry. Pre-war, Hitler's Germany had been financed by American industrialists, and post-war, those connections were not severed. One critic wrote, "Because these criminals still had close ties with U.S. corporations, the judges decided it would be wise to consider them not as disgusting homicidal ideologues, but simply as businessmen who were obliged to kill for the corporate bottom line. Despite what they'd done, they received short sentences which were then commuted, and the Friends were reunited. The fascists were now old news. Americans were expected to fear the communists, and the hefty military spending and financing of weapons had to continue." That's perhaps a cynical point of view, but it is a view many people have. It makes more sense when you understand that Allen Dulles and his brother John, who would go on to become arguably the most powerful men in the U.S., had been partners at Sullivan and Cromwell, a prestigious and immensely powerful law firm. Through this firm, with wealthy American industrialists, they'd done a lot of business with Hitler's new Germany pre-World War II. As Stephen Kinzer wrote in his excellent book, The Brothers, these men channeled American money into Nazi Germany. Hitler had needed them. The brothers did business with the German arms companies. They did business with IG Farben. Even when Hitler was spouting his hateful rhetoric about Jews and Aryan superiority, much of Wall Street was backing German firms. During the war, Allen Dulles, then an OSS spy, used a network of German business leaders, sometimes Nazis, who made money from slavery and death to secure the U.S. economic interests in Europe. Were such people now exaggerating the communist threat so they could go about their business in Europe and abroad? That's a controversial question, but a high communist threat level certainly helped get Nazis into the U.S. and overthrow foreign elected governments around the world. George Kennan, one of the wise men of foreign policy, once said, "Total war was not actually in the cards." He wrote about the end of World War II, saying, "In no way did the Soviet Union appear at that moment as a military threat to this country. The Soviet Union was utterly exhausted by the exertions and sacrifices of the recent war." He also once famously wrote that the U.S. had 50% of the world's wealth after World War II, with only 6% of the population, and to keep it that way, the U.S. would have to exert its military muscle and perhaps do things around the world that weren't in line with democratic values. He said of maintaining power, "This process cannot be a liberal or peaceful one." In short, what the public heard and what was happening were often very different. Blome was one of the most wanted Nazis after McCloy's controversial sentence reductions. Even though Blome's accelerated paperclip papers were all in order and he was ready to get on a plane to the US, someone had forgotten to write in Blome's OMGUS report that he wasn't a security threat. This meant little in terms of ethical concerns, but it meant that Blome would not get his US visa. Blome had been packed and ready to go. He was apparently in a foul mood when he was told the reason for the denial of entry. Ironically, he then took a job near Frankfurt, taking over from Walter Schreiber at Camp King. He was given a nice house and moved in on November 30th, 1951. He would never get to the U.S. Schreiber was already in Texas working at the School of Aviation Medicine on about $200,000 a year. He enrolled his son in a good school and even brought his 84-year-old grandmother over. Schreiber could have been said to be living the American dream, but all that came undone when the famed war crimes investigator Leo Alexander and a concentration camp survivor, Janina Iwanska, told the story about what this man had done to her and others, the so-called rabbits, who had their body parts removed under Schreiber's orders. The U.S. public heard how these Nazi doctors had broken Iwanska's legs. They'd done surgery on her. She woke up in pain, not knowing what they'd taken out. They cut her, and they filled her cuts with bacteria. She had gangrene because of this. They then pumped her with experimental drugs. 9 years later, she still limped. Dr. Leo was unaware of Schreiber's lethal interrogation work with U.S. intelligence and demanded that Schreiber be banned from ever practicing medicine again in the U.S., where he'd been lecturing on winter and desert warfare, the bubonic plague, vaccines, and hygiene. His background, which was then completely unknown to Americans, was exposed in an article by the Boston Globe. The Air Force didn't want to give him up. A memo classified as secret and shared among the FBI, Air Force, and other military figures said that Schreiber had a wealth of well-detailed, exact information and knew things that would greatly benefit the U.S. in the event of total war. It didn't help. Miss Iwanska told the FBI that she'd seen Schreiber at the camp, where many women, known as Ravensbrück rabbits, had parts of their anatomy removed and were sometimes taken out and shot after the operation. She said she was there when 74 women were operated on. 5 died 48 hours after the operation and 6 were shot after the operation. She said she didn't know if Schreiber had ordered this, but she said she was a part of it. This caused an uproar among the U.S. public, who were now asking how many more of these Germans in the U.S. were not as harmless as they'd been told. The indefatigable Alexander provided details of the typhus and yellow fever experiments, which killed up to 80% of the prisoners involved. He talked about how women died after the Nazi doctors infected them with something and gave them an experimental vaccine. He talked about how women had been killed with an injection of phenol to their hearts to test euthanasia techniques, more convenient and less bloody than a bullet to the head. Alexander went as far as to write to President Truman saying that this man Schreiber was not just a killer but a sadist. How much Truman would have known about Schreiber's interrogation work with U.S. intelligence in Germany is not clear. He may not have known anything about it. Schreiber denied everything. He refused to leave America, which he'd grown very fond of. Still, he had to go for the sake of saving face. He could be useful for intelligence elsewhere. Lieutenant Colonel G.A. Little of the Joint Chiefs of Staff went to California, where Schreiber and his family were now. He was there to persuade Schreiber to go to Buenos Aires, where there would be job opportunities, perhaps through his office. Little later wrote that he offered the Schreiber family transportation to South America, funds for travel, and a travel allowance for the Schreiber family group. Schreiber had one more thing he wanted in Argentina. He demanded to be called von Schreiber. After all, didn't intelligence documents say he came from Prussian royalty? He died in 1970. In 1952, Mr. McCloy made waves again. He wrote to the Secretary of State, saying that if they kept stealing Nazi scientists, it might cause a violent reaction in West Germany. Again, he was thinking about the relationships of political powers. The CIA, which was seemingly not bound to any kind of laws, kept recruiting Nazis, but officially Paperclip was finished. Annie Jacobsen wrote that the JIOA had become furious when the CIA secretly started poaching all the best Nazis, including scientists and technicians. In the end, the Nazis that were hired met very different fates. Von Braun was hailed as a hero who helped the US get to the moon, while people such as Blume and Schreiber were swept under the rug. Their names were eventually pulled from under that rug. The Nazi scientists with SS or SA pasts, the one who'd been dedicated Nazis, did as much as they could over the years to whitewash their histories. For many of them, it was impossible, such as Hubertus Strugold, whose story was eventually revealed. Strugold denied it, but it was plain and clear. He was one of Hitler's main scientists. In 1973, the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service announced it was going to investigate all the cases of possible Nazi war criminals living in the U.S., some of whom had had buildings or awards or foundation grants named after them. Some weren't just hired, they were made into heroes. A guest essay for the New York Times in 2022 said, "It is astounding that institutions like the Army, NASA, and leading universities persist in insulting the sacrifice of thousands of American soldiers by openly celebrating Nazi weapon makers." In the 1980s, the Justice Department investigated Arthur Rudolph. He subsequently lost his citizenship and left the country. More evidence came to light in the following years, thanks to investigators at the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations. It said Nazis were indeed knowingly granted entry into the U.S. The report said America, which prided itself on being a safe haven for the persecuted, became in some small measure a safe haven for the persecutors as well. Parts of the report were redacted. Many of the details were completely omitted. We still don't know the entire scope of the U.S.'s dealings with Nazis. We don't know how many were invited, not just through Paperclip, but also through other government channels. Thousands got into the U.S. in total. We do know that 300 Nazi persecutors were deported, lost their U.S. citizenship, or were blocked from entering the U.S. But if it weren't for researchers like Annie Jacobsen, whose Freedom of Information requests told us much more than government investigations, we'd know much less. She wrote in her book that many of her information requests were never answered. Who knows, in the years to come we might still be shocked and learn more about the Nazis who made it to America. Until then, don't expect schools to start teaching the ins and outs of realpolitik. Now you need to watch World War II Day by Day, or check out this video instead.